Welcome to Destination Change, a podcast where we talk recovery, treatment, and more. I'm your host, Angie Fiedler-Sutton, with the National Behavioral Health Association Providers, and I use she/her pronouns. My guest today is Zach Rothenberg. He/him serves as, quote, outside general counsel and legal advisor to behavioral health businesses, including residential and outpatient treatment centers, sober living environments, and ancillary businesses such as billing companies, laboratories, psychology and psychiatric practices, and the like. Zach regularly represents behavioral health clients in litigation matters in state and federal courts and in arbitration, in matters relating to contract disputes, reimbursement matters against commercial and government payers, employment matters, zoning and land use disputes. Zach also provides regulatory compliance advice on matters relating to marketing and business development, payer audits, clawbacks, overpayment demands, and ECRA issues, among others. Zach is a regular presenter at regional and national conferences within the behavioral health community, and has done several webinars with MBHealth. Welcome to Destination Change, Zach.
Thanks. It's great to be here. I really appreciate you having me on.
Now, regular listeners know what my first question is always the same. I always like to hear what I call origin stories. You know, there are a lot of job possibilities out here. What made you decide to do this versus, accounting or something else?
Well, it's sort of an evolution over many years. I always really liked school. So I worked really hard in school, got good grades. And for some reason, the next step seemed to be becoming a lawyer. And I really had no idea what kind of lawyer I'd be. I guess I imagined myself in a courtroom, but mostly just because I didn't know what other kinds of lawyers existed. So I went to law school. I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed sort of the intellectual pursuit of it, and even thought about continuing on with school after law school and going back to grad school and getting a PhD. Decided not to do that as the debt mounted and became a practicing lawyer. Spent probably 10 years as like a courtroom lawyer, a litigator, doing all sorts of different cases, tended towards entertainment related things just by virtue of being in Los Angeles. And just, it never quite felt like I found my spot or my people. And really just by happenstance started to take on some work in healthcare generally. And it just, a light bulb went off of I really like the kind of left brain, kind of nerdiness of healthcare and healthcare lawyers. And so I jumped in with both feet as a healthcare lawyer. And then quickly after that, found behavioral health and SUD treatment industry and just started to explore that. And what really struck me was the community. I had never really experienced this in any other industry before, of there just being a really organized, coherent community of people, of, actual clinicians and business owners and ancillary, billers and people like me and accountants and whoever that are really focused on this really specific industry. And I just really felt welcome and like it was something I wanted to be a part of. And that was probably 10 years ago. And so really ever since, the I would say more than 3/4 of my practice is in the industry. And it gives me meaning.
Great. Now, you were not my first lawyer I interviewed. I also interviewed Harry Nelson, who you obviously know, having worked for him in the past. But I know that there is no such thing as a typical day, but kind of walk me through what you actually do on a day-to-day basis.
Sure. So it's really all over the place. I'm by training a litigator, so I'm almost always working on a handful of lawsuits in the background. And unlike what you see on TV, lawsuits take forever. They take years. So there's always work to be done on these kind of long, big, slow moving cases. So that's kind of always going on. I've got things on my many screens on my computer with, legal papers and drafting briefs and those sorts of things. But then also peppered throughout the day, I'm answering the phone. People call me with, clients call me with HR questions of, do we have to, accommodate this person who says they have a disability? We want to terminate this person. How can we pay this person? Can they be an independent contractor? Do they have to be an employee? I answer questions about billing issues or potential disputes that are bubbling up and how to avoid litigation, which is usually my primary focus because litigation is expensive and time consuming and miserable. Dealing with the city, all sorts of just day to day problem solving. People tend to turn to me to just try to fix things. And so I spend, I walk in each day with kind of a plan of how my day is going to go and, a to-do list. And it always gets interrupted by 9:30 in the morning. I'm off doing something else that I wasn't anticipating because the phone rang and somebody's got a crisis.
Is there typically one type of question you tend to get more than the others, or is it it varies depending on the day, on the week, on the month, that kind of stuff?
It's all over the place, and I can put it into a handful of categories probably. So I get a lot of compliance questions about ECRA is always a hot topic, kind of kickback issues, people asking about how they could pay their marketers and business development and admissions folks. I get a lot of employment related questions all day long, a lot of we'll call it reimbursement or payer dispute issues, audits and clawbacks and overpayment demands and those sorts of things. Increasingly, zoning and land use related issues where cities are trying to zone out sober livings a lot of the time, but also now licensed facilities as well. Really, all sorts of things.
That actually leads perfectly into my next question. I was going to bring
Mhm.
up NIMBY, not in my backyard, for those who are unfamiliar with the acronym, and zoning laws. You said that that's kind of become more and more popular, not popular, but more and more an issue, I should say.
Mhm.
Kind of talk a little bit to that and what you think might be the trend going forward and that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So I know it's these issues have been around for a long time. It's a constant sort of battle line between the provider community and communities. I think particularly in highly concentrated areas like Orange County or Malibu, right? They call the rehab Riviera. Probably similar things in South Florida, although I know a little bit less about that just because I'm located here in Southern California, where communities, I don't know, I guess I'm cynical about it, but probably say, in theory, we love the idea that, there's treatment out there. We think people should get treatment. We just wish it happened somewhere else because we're afraid of the house next door with, people in recovery smoking cigarettes in the backyard and a lot of, single young men. And so there's a fear factor at play. And cities and counties are always getting more and more sophisticated and aggressive in how they draft their zoning laws with a goal of minimizing the number of treatment centers and the number of sober living homes in their community. So I'll give you some examples. Right now, I'm dealing with a couple of cities in Orange County who have passed relatively new ordinances directed at sober livings to essentially to require all sober livings to get a special use permit, meaning needing kind of government approval before you can operate. Whereas in the past, there it had been a by right use, meaning that you could open up a sober living and not need anyone's permission, and it would had to be treated like a single family. So that's a big battle line at the moment, and we are with certain clients, it's a tough thing because it is not always a great use of clients' money, particularly when it comes to sober living, to fight these fights because they're very, very expensive. And cities have, a big war chest for fighting these kind of battles. And sometimes it's much easier just to say, hey, I'll move my sober living to another city and take my chances over there. And so that's frequently what happens. But every now and again, it is worth it to fight the fight, and so we take those battles on under federal law, under the Fair Housing Act, and the Americans with Disabilities Act, and California law as well, FIHA, and some other state statutes. And so that's a big one. Another big issue that we're seeing, this is really recent, since probably October, is in the city of Los Angeles. It's a really concerning one that I know I've had some communication with your team as well, with Pete Nielsen and some others. For many years, well, let me back up. So there's a statute under the Health and Safety Code that protects licensed treatment centers, so residential treatment centers with 6 beds or fewer. And this statute says that they have to be treated like a single family home for purposes of zoning. So wherever the Rothenberg family could live, so too could there be a licensed treatment center treating 6 people or fewer. And that's been a state law for many, many years. Okay, so that's part one. One issue that I know many providers have, and I'm not a clinician, I'm not an operator, but what I hear is that owning and operating a single 6 bed is very difficult. The margins are so thin that it can be prohibitive to be that small. And so one way around that, or one way to deal with that, is by getting what's called an integral license, which says you can have, call it 2 6-bed residential treatment centers or 3. And instead of having them kind of stand alone and operate as their own thing with their own license, you can have them all under the same license, under an integral license. So it might be 3 buildings right in a row on a street, all under the same license. For many years, the city of Los Angeles would look at each of those buildings and say, are they 6 or fewer? And if they're 6 or fewer, they get this protection that says they have to be treated like a family. You can imagine the alternative way of looking at this, which would be to say, let's look at all 3 buildings together under this same integral license and say, oh no, these are 18 beds. And now they don't get the protection of that statute. So for many years, Los Angeles interpreted that by looking at each building and said, yeah, the 3 buildings in a row, they might be under a single license, but they're still 3 separate buildings. They can operate in a single family neighborhood. And it seems like something has happened where that is changing. And now people who are applying for an integral license for exactly that scenario, say 3 beds, 3 houses in a row or 3 addresses on one big lot, the fire department, the LAFD, is no longer taking the steps required in order to allow the provider to get the integral license. So people have bought these houses thinking they're going to have 18 beds to operate under this integral license, and now they're not able to get the license. So this has been a big problem that has happened all of a sudden that has affected, I think, dozens probably of operators around town. And we're fighting really hard. We filed a number of lawsuits to force the city to issue the fire clearance so that the license can be secured, so that these guys can go back to operating under their integral licenses. That was a lot of information, a long story. If you have any more questions about that, please follow up with me. I know it's affecting a lot of people all over Los Angeles.
Yeah, and for listeners, you'll know that at the end we'll get his contact info, so if you want to follow up with that. Now, you've mentioned LA and California, and you're obviously based in LA, but you are, at the time of this recording, with Pulcinelli. They are national?
Yep.
Okay.
We are. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say we are roughly 1,200 lawyers across the country in all major cities. And, we have sort of a full service practice, all sorts of industries and areas, but we have a particularly large healthcare practice, which is what attracted me to the firm a couple of years ago. And particularly in California, a really thriving behavioral health practice. We are probably one of the largest, if not the largest, in California.
Now, I will be upfront and say my knowledge of how attorneys and lawyers work is very, very vague. So correct me if I'm wrong, but you are also, like behavioral health people, licensed and you can only practice in a certain state, correct?
Yes and no. It's a little bit complicated. There are certain kind of, so most of my practice is in California, is in Southern California, but we are able to give sort of broad advice in other jurisdictions. And of course, I have colleagues in all other jurisdictions. So effectively, my firm represents plenty of treatment centers and other behavioral health providers all across the country.
Now, I'm sure it varies from place to place in terms of what the current issues are for the behavioral health industry. But do you see some common trends that are going on right now in terms of where we're going to be going in the next few years?
Yeah, I do. it sure feels, and I kind of feel like this all the time. If you had asked me 3 years ago, I might give you the same answer. It feels like the industry is just getting squeezed from all directions, and it's maddening because it's not like the demand is going away. So it's a really, to me, it's kind of a frustrating scenario where there's so much demand and so many people who want to help, but then there's just forces from every direction that just make it more and more difficult all the time. So one of those, and I'm sorry to be so pessimistic about it. One of those is sort of the zoning issues I mentioned. That communities are getting more and more aggressive in trying to attack the industry from that direction. I am finding more and more clients getting barraged with employment related issues. For whatever reason, I think there are employment, like sort of plaintiffs, lawyers out there who are targeting the industry. And I'm not really sure why, but I just have seen a real uptick in the number of clients that have these issues and the number of just of issues. So getting demand letters from former employees and threats of class actions and these sorts of things. So I think it's if I were a provider, I would really be sure I'm sort of tightening my ship on HR related issues and making sure I have a really good HR team. I've got my handbooks in place, and that I really know what I'm doing on that front. Another trend is sort of enforcement, fraud and abuse enforcement. I think ECRA, which we all know about, for many years was really just targeting or folks who are using ECRA to for enforcement, um, federal regulators were really hitting just the lowest of low hanging fruit of just really egregious kickback schemes and things that everybody throughout the industry would agree is terrible and harmful and despicable. I think I think at this point, ECRA is now being used to target sort of the less low hanging, for more of the gray area. And so I think it is really important for providers to understand ECRA. It is not always intuitive. It certainly criminalizes harmful conduct, but it criminalizes some other conduct that isn't so obviously harmful. So you really need to be aware of what it says, what it allows, and what it doesn't to sort of know how to manage and mitigate your risk. The other related piece of that is the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, has been much more active in the space and going after the ways that treatment centers are marketing, and particularly in when it comes to digital marketing. And they are looking at what they would call consumer confusion. So they're looking, for example, at, and I'm not a highly tech focused person, but the ways that people's digital marketing will kind of fake out a consumer and they think they're clicking on one treatment center, but really getting sent somewhere else, or they think that they are clicking on a directory, right? That just lists all of the treatment centers in their area, but really it's a directory being operated by a treatment center that filters everyone that clicks on it to their own facility. So there's a bunch of ways that folks have tried to manipulate digital marketing in particular to confuse consumers, and the FTC is really hot in going after them. So I would advise folks to really have a sense of what their digital marketing team is doing, because a lot of what I've learned is that a lot of digital marketers come from other areas, other industries where things are not regulated nearly so heavily, and what may be okay if you're selling widgets is not okay in the treatment world. And it is not just the responsibility of the digital marketer to know what's legal and what's not. It's also the responsibility of the operator to know what their digital marketing team is doing. So that's what it makes me nervous. And then I spend a lot of time working with clients on to make sure that they know what their team is doing and making sure it stays on the safer side. And if I may add one more, the other trend I've noticed recently is a lot of personal injury cases stemming from fights at a treatment center or at the sober living, overdoses, things like that. Whereas in the past, it seems to me, and this is purely anecdotal, it seems to me that there was almost an understanding that these things sometimes happen. It's just the nature of the industry. Now I know that there are law firms out there who are promoting themselves as treatment center injury lawyers who really are tracking down people who get into fights at the sober living or relapse and overdose, in the sober living or even shortly after they've been discharged. And that is new to me, but can be a really kind of large burden to take on if you get hit with a case like this. So it's another one to be aware of, making sure you have the right insurance in place to cover those kinds of claims. Yeah, that's another trend as well.
You
Long
are
answer to your short question.
No, that's fine. You are actually perfect guest because I actually wanted to use the next bit to talk about our CATM, the Certificate in Addiction Treatment Marketing, and the CAMS, the Certified Admissions and Marketing Specialist, which is basically teaching people how to market ethically and legally. And just you kind of already touched on it, but just the difficulties of marketing in the industry, as well as why it's important to make sure you stay within the regulations. That's the word I'm looking for.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's so important. I've started with a number of clients doing like quarterly training sessions where I go to their treatment center or their office and meet with their admissions team or their marketing team and do like a quarterly training where usually I come in with some kind of agenda, trends or a recent case or recent investigation that I'm aware of or something. And then it's just opened up to sort of a question and answer and a discussion where we can walk through, maybe a call that went a little bit strange or that was sort of suspicious. And you want to talk through how it went and if what you said was right, because sometimes these are tricky and you're sort of on the spot. And I can appreciate that people who are answering these calls or making these calls are sort of left to kind of make really important decisions, on the fly. So it's great. I hope it is helpful to them to be able to talk these things through with their lawyer. So that's something I've been doing recently that people have really appreciated, I think.
Yeah, well, and it also covers things like consumer privacy and data security, which of course nowadays is even more important than ever, as well as ethical compensation. The idea of pay for
Mhm.
play kind of thing. Would you? AI is a big topic, especially lately, and we are actually currently working as we speak on an AI policy for behavioral health. Would you say that that kind of has affected the marketing industry as well?
I I think so. I'm not the best person to ask on this. I wouldn't say. I end up seeing more of the end result rather than digging into how those problems come up. I know there's a sort of a desire to use AI wherever possible, whether it's in marketing or documentation or assessments, and I wouldn't be surprised that people's desire to use AI leads to sort of letting go of the reins on using your own good judgment and your own ethics in how you operate. That's been my impression of, well, the AI output said this is how I should do it. And you're not imposing your own judgment and saying, is that right? Does that feel right? Does that seem like the right thing to do? So it worries me a bit. I don't know how pervasive in marketing in particular it is quite yet.
Let's get a little part of my introduction to you talked about how you present regularly at conferences. And of course, you've done plenty of webinars for us. I will be 100% honest. You're one of my favorite presenters. You're very engaging. Kind of, have you taken like speaking courses? Is it come naturally to you? Is it something that you just learned over time?
Um, I've not taken a course. No. To me, I just try to keep things as simple and casual as possible. I have recollections of like my earliest presentations when I was just getting started in this industry, and looking back, they must have been so boring. They were really detailed and earnest, and but the number of cases a lawyer needs to quote to an audience of non-lawyers is very, very, very low. If you're giving case citations during a presentation, I feel like you've made a terrible decision. And it's taken me a while to learn that the sort of the more practical you can make it, the more useful it's going to be to the listener. I learned a lot of that from working with Harry Nelson, who's a great presenter.
Yeah. Now, what is your least favorite or hardest part of what you do?
Hmm. Okay. The hardest part for me is that I am always juggling, and I wake up in the middle of the night with rapid fire thoughts of, did I do this? What about that? On Sunday night, I had this, like, what I call the Sunday scary dreams of working through a case that was just impossible. I had this issue and I just couldn't figure it out, and I almost had it and couldn't. And it was all night long going through my head. And I got up at probably 4 a.m. and I reached over to my phone and I was going to take notes about this, like, thought I had about the case. And as I was typing, I realized that was not a real case. Like, I had made it up in my dream. So just trying. I think it's just the stress. I think it's probably the short answer of I really feel committed to taking people's problems and kind of making them my own. And you do that enough for enough clients and enough things, and it eventually becomes just a lot to swallow. So that's the toughest part for me.
Sounds like a variation of the you have a term paper due tomorrow.
Yeah. It's funny. I was talking to my wife about it. She was like, "Well, it must have felt really good to wake up and realize it didn't exist." I guess mostly I just thought, like, I ruined an entire night of sleep worrying about a case that isn't real. Um,
Exactly. Now the opposite question: what is your favorite part or the easiest part of your job? One or the other, or both?
so I have a lot of clients who are much younger than me, and my sense is that kind of are doing this, operating a behavioral health business kind of as a labor of love to kind of give back, and may not have a deep background in business. And I have found, and what I enjoy is that people call me not just for deep in the weeds legal advice. How does this statute work with that statute? But also just for, like, sound judgment. And I really I love to play that role. It's one of the things that sort of drove me to becoming a lawyer. I think back. I remember back to college. The role I always played among my group of friends is, like, if we were having a big party and the RA knocked on the door, they would always run and get me because I would be the one who would have, like, the even keel who could get everyone out of trouble and calm things down. And I like playing that role of just sort of helping shepherd people through crises. And that's a big part of why I became a lawyer, and that's what I particularly like about working with my clients in this industry.
Then, keeping in mind that this is not law advice, it's not legal, whatever. If you could travel back in time and talk to yourself when you were first starting out, what kind of advice would you give yourself in terms of, what lessons have you learned, kind of thing?
Yeah, this is cliche, but it's all about who you're working with, and part of that's your colleagues, like the other lawyers in your office or whatever. And I've had the good fortune of working with great lawyers that I've spent time at 3 or 4 law firms, and they've all been wonderful people. And I've been really lucky in that sense. But also the clients you're working with and the opposing lawyers that you're working with, that I think defines the quality of your day. And so I would tell young lawyers to think about who they want to be working with and try to craft a practice that meets those desires and those needs.
Would you, if someone came up to you and said, I'm interested in becoming a lawyer, would you give that same kind of advice? Would you give different advice?
I think it really depends on the person. It is not just a dream job. It's not playing point guard for the Lakers that just everyone would love. It takes a particular kind of person who likes getting into the details, who likes kind of working through complicated intellectual issues. So it's not for everyone. But if you have a feeling like you like those things, if you like, I don't know, if you're a detail kind of intellectual person, I think it can be great.
Now, you said you've been, doing this for at least 10 years. What would you say is the biggest change you've seen in the industry?
Biggest change in I find that it is harder and harder for really small providers to survive. And I think that's changing things. There's a lot of consolidation, and it feels like that is changing the industry and the culture of the industry. And it's not there yet. There's still plenty of, call it mom and pop, smaller providers that maybe have one facility. But I think it's becoming harder and harder for those folks to survive just because of the finances of it all, of the consolidation of the payers, and the competition is getting stiffer when you've got private equity backed, huge businesses with deeper pockets that sort of do more marketing. It's just getting harder and harder for the little guy to survive. That's probably true in every industry, but I'm seeing that a lot here.
Mhm. Now, again, the industry is changing on a regular basis, both, lawyer, attorney, as well as the behavioral health industry. Do you have like newsletters or websites or books that you like keep in mind to kind of keep abreast of what's going on in the industry?
That's a good question. I spend a lot of time looking at government websites. You know, there are federal government websites that talk a lot about ECRA. The FTC is pretty good about kind of publicizing what it's doing, and you can extrapolate from that. So I think it's less newsletters for me than it is sort of scouring the internet on a regular basis so you can see, for example, these new zoning laws I was mentioning earlier on in Orange County. I came across those just by doing kind of a regular kind of, you know, Google search through some of the zoning changes in California that I do on a quarterly basis or so. And these things just kind of pop up. Yeah. So I don't know that it's like a real specific resource for you, but it's spending a lot of time surfing on the internet to find out how what the feds are doing, what cities are doing, um, those sorts of things.
Okay. Now we're getting close to the end. Was there something that you wanted to talk about that we haven't, or that you thought I was going to ask, but I didn't?
I don't think so. I was an open book when I came into this with no expectations.
Well, I always ask because every once in a while they're like, oh, I was hoping you'd ask me about X,
Mm,
Y, and Z kind of thing.
nothing for you.
Okay, now this is kind of a reiteration of the first question, but I want kind of
Mhm.
off the top of your head, just gut reaction. Why do you do what you do?
It gives me meaning. It's the hardest one of the hardest parts about being a lawyer at a law firm is that you're not personally like building anything. You're helping other people build things, which is rewarding, but I don't know. Sometimes I look back and it's like I just think about these like ships that have passed in the night, and I'm glad I was able to help them and they've gone on and done their thing. But it can, for me, it can leave me a little bit community-less. So I really, it is valuable to me just on an emotional level, on a personal level, to feel like I am part of this treatment community. On the periphery, I would never profess that I'm like really doing the hardest work, but peripherally, I'm a member of this community, and it adds a lot of meaning to my practice.
Great. Now, if people want to get a hold of you or learn more about you, where can
Mhm.
they find you?
Yep. So my law firm is called Polsinelli, Polsinelli. I have to picture it every time I say it. And if you Google my name, Zachary Rothenberg, you'll find me. You'll certainly find me on the Polsinelli website, polsinelli.com, on LinkedIn, Zachary Rothenberg. I'm not hard to find.
And for those who do not check out the show notes, it's Rothenberg, Rothenberg, just in case. I've learned through my years, you can always spell every name at least two different ways. You also, as I mentioned, have done several webinars from us. The most recent, as of this recording, was one on anti-harassment and discrimination training. Though we will link to those in the show notes as well. So they are free to attend if you are free to take if you're an NBHAP member, and they're only I think $50 if you're not an NBHAP member. It's just a little incentive to become an NBHAP member. So awesome. You've been listening to Destination Change. Our guest today was Zach Rothenberg. Thank you for being here. Our theme song was Sun Nation by Kitsa and used via Creative Commons license by the Free Music Archive. Please consider rating and reviewing the podcast on Apple Podcasts so we can get more listeners. In the meantime, you can always see more about the podcast, including show notes and where else to listen, on our website, www.nbhap.org. If you have questions for the podcast, please email us at info@nbhap.org. Thanks for listening.